Recording. So someone wanted to say something. Well, welcome. And once again, as we've been discussing, we're conducting this meeting via Zoom. And again, for all of you who don't know Bill, he's the facilitator and the meeting's being recorded. If you like, you can leave your pictures on so we see who's there. And when we get the questions and answers, maybe you want to handle that too, Bill, unless Doug wants to do it directly. We'll work that out when we get there. In the meantime, I'd like to call on Sandy Samala, who is going to give us words of inspiration.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate the opportunity to give today's words of inspiration. I've selected today a few words from Ralph Waldo Emerson, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but I think they're very appropriate in today's world particularly. And they also express my true feelings of the world today. So let me start. To laugh often and much, to win the respect of the intelligent people and the affection of children, to earn appreciation of honest critics and endure the betrayal of false friends, to appreciate beauty, to find the beauty in others, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition, to know that one life has breathed easier because you lived here. This is to have succeeded. And that's it. Thanks, Joe.
Well, thank you, Sandy. That was very good. Yeah, I'm going to want to get a copy of that.
Okay, I will be sure to send you one.
Good, thank you. So next I was going to talk, we've already pretty much talked about the situation with the COVID. The one thing I guess the only other sentence that I can think of was that if we think there was like 40 cases in Grantham, you can pretty much multiply that times 5 or 10, depending on which factor is more appropriate, because those are only the recorded ones. And with the self-testing kits, there's probably at least twice, 2 or 3, 4, 5 times that amount. So again, the decision was made to go Zoom, and hopefully the numbers are starting to come back down, at least in the rural areas around us. So hopefully our next meeting will be in person. At least that's today what we're shooting for. And that's basically what this organization is all about, is getting together in person. Here's one of my favorite parts of the meetings, when we get to bring in a new candidate, vote on a new candidate, and we do have one. So I'm going to just turn this over right at this point to Art Rosen for introduction.
All right, thank you, Joe. It's good to be here again, and especially good to be nominating or proposing Scott Ward for membership. Many of our members will recall our May meeting where he and his wife, Sandy, both retired colonels from the U.S. Air Force, provided the presentation for us. Scott's background began in the military, began with ROTC at Norwich University, where he earned both a bachelor's and a master's degree. While in the service, he attended Air War College and anti-terrorism school, played crucial roles in counter-drug and homeland security operations. He specialized in command and control operations and served as an Air Force battle manager. He and his wife, Sandy, as I say, both colonels, settled in Newbury, and they are both members of the Newbury Veterans Committee. And with Scott joining our membership, we now have 7 members from the Newbury Veterans Committee who are part of Country Squires. So I'm very pleased to propose Scott Ward for membership.
So having thus proposed Scott, all those in favor of becoming a member, raise their hand. so be it. You squeaked by, Scott. So welcome.
Well, thank you very much.
Welcome aboard. You'd like to say hello or anything to the group? You just did, I guess. So if you want to say a couple words, fine. If not, we're all set.
Sure. Thanks a lot, guys. I really appreciate it. I think you're a great group. I was very interested in coming to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to our next meeting when we all be together.
Great. Thanks again. So I owe you a pen. New members get a pen to the organization. Just new members. A lot of the old folks say, I haven't got one. Well, that was a new thing they started a couple of years back. I guess now I'd like to, by the way, I always have to mention that, and John can correct me if I'm off on my numbers, but during these past couple of years, which have been tough years for all organizations, we have lost a pretty sizable number of members. Sadly, some of them passed away, some moved, and others, far fewer, just discontinued their joining the organization. But on the upside, we have taken in during this period of time over 30, I think it's around 34, 35 members going back over the last couple of years. And considering, you know, the circumstances, I think that's really quite an accomplishment to, again, thank you all. And also remember, I always have to put a plug in that we're always looking for new members. We used to have a maximum of 165. That's been deleted. Not that we're going to exceed it right away, but we are, and we will have in the future other considerations coming up as far as age requirements or boundaries of where people can come from. But also, if you know anybody that's younger, we're all in the same age bracket for the most part. And it'd be nice if we can get a few more folks like Bill Mattson in here. I just want to make sure he's awake up at the top there. But anyway, yeah, so that's just a plug for trying to get more folks into the organization. And remember, as a guest, they come and they eat free. The Squires picks up that tab. And so, Scott, you already had your free lunch last month when you were the speaker. Okay, so now I'd like to turn the meeting over to Bill Helm, who will introduce our speaker for today.
Great, thanks, Joe. It's a pleasure to welcome my good friend Doug Lyon to the Squires. Doug's professional career was in education, culminating in his tenure as the Treasurer and Chief Financial Officer of Colby-Sawyer College, after which, or during which, Doug also began a second career as a volunteer. He's just mentioned to us that he's been chair of the New London Hospital Board for a number of years. He also was a selectman for several terms in New London, and perhaps his most well-known accomplishment, public well-known accomplishment, was his getting the rotary at the intersection Newport Road and County Road installed, a major win for all of those who go up and down that part of New London. Doug is currently the chair of the Zoning Board of Adjustment in New London. He's on the fire wards, where he takes care of making sure the fire department is run properly. And in his free time, he is an advocate for the recreational use of guns. And so it's with particular pleasure and timeliness that we welcome Doug Lyon to our meeting today.
Hello, everybody. And unless you've been living under a rock the last few weeks, you've seen a flood of information on gun violence as a result of the Uvalde massacre. I'm going to try to put this whole situation in a historical and comparative context and discuss some possible solutions. Joe kindly sent out email to all of you that reference a couple of histories on the evolution of the National Rifle Association, because I want to be clear that there is a legitimate recreational use for firearms that has a long tradition and resides today alongside the NRA extreme position. I was a competitive shooter for years, and with my fellow competitors, we enjoyed a friendly atmosphere, skill development, and an enjoyable sport. We were all NRA members because the NRA kept the tournament scores for all the leagues, and it was a sportsman's organization. This was before the NRA was hijacked by extremists. There are many shooting leagues. There are rifle leagues, small bore, high power and air rifle, pistol leagues, both center fire and rim fire. There's the shotgun world of skeet and trap shooting, and there are specialty leagues for such things as cowboy action shooting while riding horses, biathlon shooting and cross-country skiing, and bench rest rifle, which is a test of precision ammunition loading skills. Bench rest shooters warm up their rifle barrels before the meet starts by shooting flies off their targets at 100 yards. Some of these are Olympic sports like biathlon and air rifle. Every year at Camp Perry in Ohio, the national firearms matches include the civilian marksmanship, program national trophy pistol and rifle matches, the pistol and rifle small arms firing schools, the national games rifle matches, the national small bore matches, and national long range matches. Incidentally, in shooting, men and women compete equally, except in the Olympics, which is still controlled by misogynists, because it's not a strength sport, it's a balance sport. In 2003, specialist Liana Bombardier won the Atkins Trophy as the highest scoring service rifle shooter in the National High Power Rifle Long Range Championships, which require shooting at 600, 800, 900, and 1,000 yards. I have FBI agents in my family, and my late wife was president of New England Canine Search and Rescue, a group that worked for law enforcement in New Hampshire and Vermont using air scent dogs to find lost persons. So I spent a lot of time with law enforcement personnel, and you learn when you do that there is a legitimate use for firearms in self-defense. I have a concealed carry license, although it's no longer required in New Hampshire. I usually carry when I leave the house, but I also have had a lot of training, and I have a bullet trap in my garage and keep my skill levels up. I believe that no one should own a gun if they aren't willing to take courses on its use and practice a lot. There are also many excellent non-lethal alternatives for self-defense now, and I recommend them to folks who ask me about buying a gun. Okay, I'm off my soapbox now, and we'll get into the issue of gun violence. First, some facts about firearms violence from a variety of sources that I won't take time to credit. I want you to know I freely plagiarized everything in here. Remember that the NRA has successfully blocked initiatives on studying gun violence. So data largely depends on the collecting efforts of private research groups like the Pew Research Center. Given the recent number of mass shootings, you probably all read statistics as well on this subject. Overall, it's estimated there are 875 million guns in the world, and 75% of them are civilian controlled. About half of these are in the United States, which has the highest rate of gun ownership in the world. In fact, the US has more guns than people, 1.2 guns per capita. Levels of gun-related violence vary greatly among geographical regions, countries, and even subnationally. Rates of violent deaths by firearm range from as low as 0.03 and 0.04 per 100,000 population in Singapore and Japan to 59 and 67 per 100,000 in Honduras and Venezuela. The highest rates of violent deaths by firearm in the world occur in low-income South and Central American countries, such as Honduras, Venezuela, Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Jamaica. The United States has the 11th highest rate of gun violence in the world, and by far the highest of any large or highly developed nation. The United States has a gun homicide rate, which is 25 times higher, an unintentional gun death rate, which is 6 times higher, a firearm suicide rate, which is 8 times higher, and an overall firearm death rate, which is 10 times higher than the average respective rates of other high-income nations. The United States has a total rate of firearm deaths, which is 50 to 100 times greater than that of many similarly wealthy nations with strict gun control laws, such as Japan, the United Kingdom, and South Korea. According to nearly all studies, the high rate of gun violence in the United States, which has the highest rate of gun-related deaths per capita among developed countries, despite having the highest per capita rate of police officers, is attributable to its extreme rate of gun ownership. And it is, in fact, the only nation with more guns than people. Nearly all studies have found a positive correlation between gun ownership and gun-related homicide and suicide rates. Keep in mind that more than half of gun fatalities in the US are suicides. Most people don't recognize that. The NRA position is that those deaths would have occurred anyway by other means, but research shows the opposite. Suicide is much more likely when a gun is available. My summary quickly is the NRA position that more guns in civilian hands make society safer is basically nonsense. According to the United Nations, deaths from small firearms exceed those from all other weapons combined, and more people die each year from gun-related violence than did in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. The global death rate from use of guns may be as high as 1,000 dead every day. So what makes gun control so difficult in the United States? There are 5 major reasons. The first significant barrier to gun control is that the US is one of only 3 countries in the world in which gun ownership is a constitutional right. The others are Mexico and Guatemala. Thus, court cases challenging the infringement of constitutional rights is possible here and in no other developed country. In 2008, Justice Scalia, writing for the majority in District of Columbia versus Heller, held that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to keep and bear arms. The amendment says a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. According to Scalia, the militia reference in the first part of the amendment simply announces the purpose for which the right was codified, to prevent elimination of the militia. The Constitution's framers, according to him, that were concerned that the new federal government would disarm the populace, as the British had tried to do. But he added that this prefatory statement of purpose should not be interpreted to limit the meaning of what is called the operative clause, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Instead, Scalia said the operative clause codified a pre-existing right of individual gun ownership for private use. The DC versus Heller decision emboldened challenges to all kinds of gun laws. It opened the way for individual states to remove firearm restrictions, such as New Hampshire did recently with the law eliminating the need for a permit for concealed carry. There are now 23 states that allow permitless carry, and 10 of those were added in the last few years. The second barrier to gun control regulation is political. Neither political party has been successful in advancing gun control legislation. As you all know, if you read the press, right now there's supposedly a bipartisan committee in Congress working on this issue. And my understanding is that one of the first things that was eliminated was the provision to raise the buying age of guns from 18 to 21. Republicans currently largely ignore or oppose the issue, and Democrats have enough members who are from states in which gun control is unpopular, so they're not likely to be very enthusiastic supporters. Bernie Sanders is one of those in Vermont. The gun debate heats up every time there's a mass shooting. Democrats decry gun violence and demand tougher gun laws. Republicans point to the Second Amendment and perhaps a self-defense shooting. Deadlock ensues, time passing, nothing changes, and the nation moves on until the next mass shooting. Meanwhile, the TV news continues to use the word unthinkable in describing such events, when in fact they are more accurately described as predictable. Moreover, it is not a highly important issue for the majority of Americans. A recent Pew Research Institute study found that 53% of Americans believe it is more important to control gun ownership, and 47% believe it's more important to protect the right of Americans to own guns. In our current polarized politics, it's especially difficult. Recently, Biden had to withdraw his nominee for the head of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which enforces gun laws, because of NRA pressure on Democrat Joe Manchin and Maine Independent Angus King. The ATF has only had one confirmed director since 2006, and he lasted less than 2 years. When you need all the votes from your party to pass anything, just a little push from the NRA is enough. Because gun control is unlikely to pass in Congress, Democrats eventually turn to other items on their agenda. The third major issue is state inertia. In the absence of federal action, it's left to the states to do something, and some do. Massachusetts is one of the leaders in gun control measures and not surprisingly has the lowest gun death rate among the 50 states. Unfortunately, it's located just south of New Hampshire, which has virtually no gun controls. So New Hampshire is a leading exporter of guns to Massachusetts. The same is true of Chicago, Illinois, located next to Indiana. 60% of guns used in crime in Chicago are imported from neighboring states. As long as there are many states with no gun control, meaningful gun control is much more difficult. The fourth major issue is focus on the wrong problem. The press, and therefore the public, tends to focus on mass shootings. And as horrendous as they are, they're still a very small part of the problem. It's difficult to get data on mass shootings because definitions vary, and 10% of law enforcement departments don't send data to the FBI. However, defining mass shootings as 4 or more victims, not counting the shooter, between 2016 and 2018, the annual rate of all mass shooting incidents was about 1 incident per 14 million people. Considering the number of fatalities in these mass shootings, this corresponds to approximately 0.8% of all homicides, or approximately 0.4% of all firearm deaths over that period. Now, you have to understand that different choices about how to define a mass shooting result in different findings for both the prevalence of these events at a given time and whether their frequency has changed over time. One recent news report said since 2009, 1,534 people had died in 274 mass shootings. But however you measure it, mass shootings are a small part of the gun violence problem. Guns killed more than 45,000 people in 2020 in the United States, more than traffic accidents. I want to just, on the definition basis, as something as simple as 4 victims as opposed to 4 deaths makes a big difference in how you calculate the number of mass shootings. And everybody has their own definitions for these things. And that's what makes any kind of a common set of data in this more difficult. The final major issue in preventing gun regulation in this country is public apathy from those who want gun reform. I mentioned that there's a bare majority of Americans and polls who say gun control is more important than gun rights, but it's not a major issue for them, while it is a critical issue for the gun rights population. You can guess then which group is more active and more likely to vote. This apathetic attitude was summarized in an editorial piece by Leonard Pitts Jr. in the Baltimore Sun. He was writing about the Sandy Hook massacre. He quotes Dan Hodges, a British political commentator, who said, quote, in retrospect, Sandy Hook marked the end of the US gun control debate. Once America decided killing children was bearable, it was over. Pitts goes on to say, the sad thing is there's no inherent or insoluble conflict between the desire of some of us to have access to guns for sport and self-defense and the desire of others of us to keep dangerous people from possessing those weapons. Decent, moderate people working from both sides of the question could probably hammer out ideas to safeguard both in an afternoon. The problem is, gun owners' interests are represented not by decent, moderate people, but by the National Rifle Association, which is currently an extremist gang for whom even the most modest regulation is a brick in the road to tyranny. So long as the NRA has such an outsized voice in this debate, so long as politicians tremble to its call, and so long as many of us are silent in the face of this, Mr. Hodges is correct. And we are doomed to a future of frequent, predictable, and preventable tragedies that some of us will mistake for freedom. One Republican recently said that massacres are the price of freedom in the United States. Shortly after the Uvalde massacre, Trump and Ted Cruz both appeared at the NRA convention and both lied or misled in their remarks. Neither mentioned the money they've received from the gun lobby. In Cruz's case, that's over $500,000. So what kinds of changes could make a difference? Lots of folks have credited with the quote, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. That's been the US approach for years, but I recently read a proposed new approach, a public health issue. The model is the same as the automobile. Instead of gun bans, talk gun safety. Gun enthusiasts often protest cars kill about as many people as guns and we don't ban them. No, but automobiles are actually a model for the public health approach. We don't ban cars, but we work hard to regulate them and limit access to them so as to reduce the number of deaths they cause. This has been spectacularly successful, reducing the death rate per 100 million miles driven by 95% since 1921. So what would this approach entail? Background checks. 22% of guns are obtained without one. This would include gun show loopholes, although that's not the biggest problem. Private sales by individuals are the biggest problem. Protection orders. Keep men who are subject to domestic violence protection orders from having guns. Ban under 21s. A ban on people under 21 purchasing firearms. This is already the case in many states. 6 of the last 8 mass shootings were by males under the age of 21. You might ask, as a recent editorial did, what kind of a society allows children to buy guns? My understanding of this bipartisan Congress committee that's going on now, that Republicans have already rejected raising the age limit to 21 from 18. Safe storage. These includes trigger locks as well as guns and ammunition stored separately, especially when children are in the house. It also includes gun safes that offer quick access in emergencies. Straw purchases, tighter enforcement of laws on straw purchases of weapons and some limits on how many guns can be purchased in a month. Ammunition checks, experimentation with a one-time background check for anybody buying ammunition. End immunity for firearm companies. That's a subsidy to a particular industry. If gun companies could be sued, they'd pay more attention to safe sales. But remember, the NRA extreme position is supported by the gun industry. Ban bump stocks. A ban on bump stocks of the kind used in Las Vegas to mimic automatic weapon fire. This was actually done by Trump after the Las Vegas massacre. So bump stocks, as I understand it, are now banned. Research smart guns. Smart guns fire only when a fingerprint or pin is entered, or if it is used near a particular bracelet. The NRA and its membership boycotted Smith & Wesson after it was revealed in 1999 that the company was developing a smart gun for the US government and almost put the company out of business. So you can imagine how enthusiastic the companies are about that particular solution. So could any of these be accepted? Some might, but in today's political climate, it's doubtful. One ray of hope is that when some gun dealers were educated that suicides were the leading cause of gun deaths, we began to hand out suicide prevention information. In 1 week in 2009, 3 people came into a gun shop in Hooksett, New Hampshire, and bought guns that they killed themselves with shortly thereafter. The owner was prompted to help found a movement that links members of the firearm community with public health experts to prevent suicides by raising awareness about gun safety. Its leaders are realists who accept that very strict European-style gun control is not politically feasible in the US and would in any case be a non-starter for a lot of gun sellers. But they also know there are households that keep guns and ammunition in separate locked locations and store their guns unloaded have much lower risks of accidental or intentional deaths from firearms. In addition, as a further safety measure, the group seeks to make it socially acceptable for relatives and friends to offer to hold on to a potentially suicidal gun owner's weapons until the crisis is past. Dan Gross was the president of the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence from 2012 to 2017 and is a co-founder of the Center for Gun Rights and Responsibility. In an April 8th, 21 article in the New York Times, he said the following measures could gain acceptance from the majority of gun rights folks. Number 1, vigorously pursue and prosecute the small percentage of gun dealers who are knowingly contributing to the illegal gun trade, a trade that is disproportionately hurting communities of color, by the way. Identify opportunities to...
Sorry.
Identify opportunities to strengthen the background check system by adding prohibited purchases that we all, including 90% of gun owners, agree should not have guns. For instance, federal rules governing privacy for health records could be modified to allow mental health clinicians to identify those who are a threat to themselves or others, so that they could be temporarily added to the National Instant Check System. This would have to include some exemptions for private sales that might make some people uncomfortable, but in the end, in combination with the other measures listed here, it could result in a significant improvement to public safety. Invest in large-scale education and awareness campaigns on the dangers of owning and carrying guns and what can be done to mitigate those. It is crucial that these efforts be led in partnership with gun rights groups and public health experts, and that they remain free from any judgment about gun ownership or connection with political advocacy. There are many initiatives already, such as public education about the warning signs of mental illness and suicide, which have proved effective and could be models. Expand on the work of violence interrupters and similar programs proven to reduce gun violence in cities. Clearly define what it means to be a federally licensed firearm dealer with standards that include sales volume. For years, gun control groups have talked about closing the gun show loophole. The real problem is not specifically gun shows, but people who are regularly selling multiple guns to strangers, regardless of the venue, without being required to conduct the same background check that a federally licensed dealer must. Not only does this clearly contribute to straw man purchasing and gun trafficking, it also puts honest dealers at a competitive disadvantage. Remember, one background check does not equal one gun purchase. Any of you in this meeting today could go into a New Hampshire gun shop, pass a background check, and buy 50 guns or 100. So to sum it all up, what really is the crucial issue here? And you might be surprised. It's profit. The gun industry funds and thrives on the extremist position of the NRA. And that position has infected a minority of the gun owner population. It feeds on racism and it feeds on fear. The whole notion of self-defense and the need for self-defense is a new wrinkle in the history of gun ownership in this country. And the emphasis on it in every gun publication is extreme. The gun industry has discovered that if they use the word tactical in front of any product, it increases sales. It's a militarization of thinking in the way guns are used. The issue of profit and unscrupulous corporations is not new in America. And all of you have lived through a lot of it. Unethical corporate greed in the auto industry with regard to lead pollution and opposition to seatbelts, airbags, and every other proposed safety issue. The cigarette industry with disinformation on smoking safety. The chemical industry with disinformation on the harmful effects of pesticides. The fossil fuel industry with disinformation on climate change. And the pharmaceutical industry with disinformation on opioids. And of course, we all remember the VW cheating scandal on pollution standards. In our world, unfortunately, money talks. If it's profitable, it will be done. The only thing that will combat that is voting out politicians that refuse to act on the gun issue or actively support the status quo. You can make up your own minds on how likely that is. As Mark Twain said, an honest politician is one who once bought, stays bought. Many of our congressional reps have been bought by the gun industry. And until that changes, I'm afraid nothing else is going to change. I've seen some of the proposed changes that are coming out of this bipartisan committee, and they're so watered down, I suspect they'll have no particular chance of doing anything accomplished. The Democrats in the House proposed a whole series of gun reforms, and those will be dead on arrival in the Senate when they get there. So if my tone is pessimistic, it's just that I've been watching this issue for decades now, and I haven't seen anything accomplished of any significance. And if anything, the problem has just gotten worse. The AR-15 is the most ubiquitous firearm in the country right now. And it holds 30 rounds magazines very easily, and it makes these kinds of mass killings really possible. But I don't want to obscure the fact that the majority of deaths of gun violence in this country are suicides. And they're done not with AR-15s, they're done with handguns. And 45,000 people in 2020, my guess is it'll be higher than that this year. Only a small percentage of those are mass shootings, but the fact that they involve children now is obviously deplorable and gets the media attention. But think of your news shows that you may watch and think, absent mass shootings, how infrequently you'll hear anything about the gun violence problem. So anyway, thanks for listening. I'd be glad to answer any questions you have, and I hope I haven't depressed everybody too much.
Thanks, Doug. I'll try and facilitate here. If you have questions that you'd like to ask, there's a couple ways you can do that. One is to raise your hand. I don't know if we have that feature here though. But we do have the ability in chat, or you can raise your hand, turn on your screen, whatever way you want to contribute to the conversation. I think this is a really important conversation to have, and Doug's remarks set the stage nicely. So who will go first? I'll take a shot here, Doug. The statistics that you talked about with respect to fervor on the issue, do you see that changing? I thought it would change after Sandy Hook, quite honestly. It's interesting in Australia, my understanding is that did lead to a fundamental change. I'm not sure if you're familiar with what happened in Australia, but could that be a model for hope that we might finally be shocked into some sensible changes?
I am familiar with the Australia business, and after a mass shooting in Australia that did involve young people being the victims, they put a significant ban on high-capacity weapons and shotguns and long guns of any kind. They included a buyback, a government buyback of the guns to allow people to at least not have a financial loss. And they eliminated a great many of the guns that they have in the country. There have been no mass shootings since they did that. So it is encouraging in that respect. But Australia also has no constitutional right to firearms ownership. And that makes it much more difficult in the United States. And of course, since Sandy Hook, we've had other massacres that have occurred, and nothing has happened in Congress. And I don't think it's likely to. I see Don Catino's got his hand up. Don, you're on mute. So.
Don, you need to unmute.
You have to take yourself off mute.
There you go.
Finish what you're saying, Doug. I don't want to interrupt.
Well, I was just saying that the Australia situation, it's much easier for them to pass legislation that is not going to then be pursued in court as a constitutional violation. One of my big concerns in this country right now is that given the conservative membership of the Supreme Court, is that we are going to start to see being struck down in all of the states gun control regulations that they have passed. Massachusetts is particularly concerned that some of their regulations may be declared unconstitutional. Washington, D.C. used to have a ban on handguns that was deemed unconstitutional. So there are lots of problems with something like the Australia model being replicated in the United States. Yes, sir.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
I've lived and worked in Australia five times in the last 10 years. And what I can say is they're a different people than we have here in the United States. It's a different culture. It's a different way of looking at things. So I don't know that you can, say what worked in Australia is going to work here. In Australia, when you walk down the street, people smile and say hello to you that don't know you. If that happened in New York, people would think they were going to be attacked. So I mean, we have a different way of thinking about things. So I think that needs to be taken into. I think what's going on. I mean, they think differently. I think our main problem is not the NRA. I think it's us and our mental health and our morality and our respect for the law that's at the base of all this. And as a doctor, our mental health situation in the United States is terrible. Few students, I teach at Dartmouth, few students want to go into a psychiatry or psychology. The psychiatrists only write medication orders now. They don't spend time with people working things out. We don't have enough people to deal with our mental health issues in this country. And that's a big part of it.
As a board chair for the hospital, I can tell you that that's been a huge problem because we can't find beds, especially for young people who need psychiatric assistance, and we warehoused them in the emergency rooms. New London Hospital had to convert one of its emergency room locations to essentially a secure holding cell for people with mental illness because we can't get them into hospitals. And the sad thing for those of you who've lived in New Hampshire a long time is New Hampshire used to have a mental health system that was the envy of 50 states. But after years and years and years of underfunding, it basically was destroyed by our representatives in the legislature.
So an interesting twist that is questioned by Dave Wood. Do you think laws permitting assisted suicide would reduce the frequency to gun-caused suicide?
My goodness.
I'm sorry, Bill, once more, I didn't.
Do you think laws permitting assisted suicide would reduce the frequency to gun-caused suicide?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm not an expert on it. I happen to be a believer in assisted suicide. And I think it is the law, by the way, in Maine and in other states. I think it was Oregon that pioneered it, but it is spreading. It has been voted on in the New Hampshire legislature many times and always lost. Every time it's brought up, there's a huge opposition from the Catholic Church. And that seems so far in New Hampshire to have been enough to kill it. And I think that's too bad. But whether it would reduce gun suicides or not, I think it probably would, because frankly, gun suicides are messy. And if people had an option for a less messy choice, my guess is they'd take it.
Okay.
That's an uninformed opinion from someone who's not an expert in the field.
Okay, I've got another comment here, and then I think Sandy's hand was up, and I see, Paul, you've got your hand up as well. John Dulles, fantastic presentation. Doug, what can be done to correct the public's understanding of the Second Amendment? As I understand it, the current extreme view of our constitutional right to own guns of all types and lethality was foisted on the American public starting 20 to 30 years ago, and now, of course, repeated constantly by Fox News, extremists, militias, etc.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Before the Heller decision versus Washington, D.C., the Supreme Court had always thought of the Second Amendment as relating to the National Guard, because the National Guard was the equivalent of the militia. And also remember that in colonial times, gun ownership was frequent because all those people were members of the militia. But those guns were also generally stored in centralized locations. And it was this position of Scalia's and this notion of originalism, which is so open to so many subjective viewpoints, that when you have a conservative court you can basically say the framers believe this. And I think the best quote on this was from Obama when he was asked about originalism. And he said, the people who wrote the Constitution didn't agree on what it meant. Therefore, how can somebody 200, 300 years later tell you what they meant? And I think it's just a way of pushing various conservative opinions. But the problem right now is that practically the interpretation of the Second Amendment hinges on what the current Supreme Court says. And that would be extremely, even if we educated people on the words, and most people, by the way, the NRA, when it talks about the Second Amendment, never uses the first part of the phrase. They always say the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but they never include the part about the militia. And I think a lot of people just think that's what it says. But with knowing that there was a preamble to that statement make anybody think differently, I have no idea.
Sandy.
Yes, thanks, Bill. Doug, first of all, very nice discussion. You brought out some excellent points. One question I have, though, is that you mentioned about the industry, the gun industry, now using a strategy of self-defense as an aggressive way to market their products. There are less lethal ways of protecting oneself, and I'm thinking of tasers and stun guns. I don't know how effective those things are, but could there be some maybe promotion of those kinds of things to work in a self-defense mode? Obviously, the gun industry is not going to be participating there, but is there any way that those things can be reinforced?
Yeah, I think there's the potential for that, Sandy. Tasers and other items like that, the legality of them varies from state to state. But they, excuse me, I forgot to shut this thing off. The legality varies from state to state, and they are, on the whole, relatively short range. You see people carrying these little tear gas spray things. I played around with some of those. The effective range of those things is about 2 feet. And you basically don't want, if you're in a self-defense situation, you want to be as far away from it, the assailant, as possible. But what has started to come out now is tear gas guns, which also fire hard plastic projectiles about ½ an inch in diameter. And a company called Byrna, B-Y-R-N-A, is one of the ones that's promoting these things. And you can go on the internet and find that they make not only handgun size, and a critical thing, they make them in colors. That's really, really critical, because if a cop sees a Byrna, he doesn't know whether it's a tear gas gun or a real gun. But if it's orange, nobody manufactures real guns in orange. And so those are the kinds of things that you have to think about. I have gotten to the point now, so when I got a lot of people over the years that came to me for advice on buying firearms. I don't recommend them anymore. I suggest that people look at the Byrnas, and quite frankly, they seem much happier to do that. And it seems to be less troubling to think about it. For me personally, I can't imagine why we allow sales to people. I've been in gun shops and watched people walk in who have no idea how to deal with a handgun and simply buy one on some dealer's recommendation. If it's a woman, they typically sell them the smallest thing that they can find in there. And that has enormous recoil. And the first thing that woman's going to do is find that a very unpleasant experience. And those are but yet we peddle that stuff all the time. And it drives you crazy if you are a responsible gun owner to see that kind of crap happening. It really does. So I think the burner and the non-lethal things is the way for people to go, quite frankly. And I don't recommend that people buy them anymore unless, it's somebody who I know is a gun enthusiast and he's asking my opinion on a particular firearm that I happen to know something about. That's fine. But for the average person, what they're going to do with a gun is they're going to stick it in the desk drawer in case they need it. And if it's a semi-automatic, by the time they need it, they'll have forgotten how to use it. The magazine won't load properly. All sorts of problems will be associated with it. But that's what most people do who own guns. They stick it in the desk drawer and hope it'll work. And they just assume it will. Revolvers, yes, fairly reliable, but not semi-autos, and those are the majority of sales these days. So,
Paul, you had your hand up?
Yep.
Yes. Doug, good job. Wonderful, I think, in explaining the whole issue with NRA and so forth. But I constantly get confused, even though at times I think I'm not confused. The Heller situation, if I understand that correctly, that gives the constitutional right to have a gun in your house to protect your family. Isn't that what it's all about? Is that right or wrong?
It codified the right of private ownership of a gun for personal use.
Oh, it didn't include in the home?
It did not.
Oh, I thought it did. That's okay.
It does not preclude regulation. And it's frequently, gun rights advocates are quickly selling. Heller said you couldn't have any rules on gun control. And that's simply not true. And the problem is that because of the conservative nature of the Supreme Court, they are ruling against a lot of reasonable gun rules and gun regulations. But the Heller decision didn't relate specifically to having one in your house.
Okay, thank you.
Mark, you figured out how to virtually raise your hand. The floor is yours. You need to unmute. There you go.
There you go. Okay. So in general, an excellent presentation. And I specifically would like to talk about the comment about this being funded by the firearms industry. One of the ways, the major way we got to solutions with cigarettes, narcotic prescriptions, and auto safety was by the plaintiff's bar going after the funders of all these things. And much as I hate this litigation explosion that we seem to have, this may be our best chance to address this. If we can go after the people who are profiting from this and take away the profit from it, then that may go a long way towards solving some of the problem.
Mark, I think that there are, first of all, as you probably already know, there is a law that was passed in the United States that essentially gives the gun industry immunity for damage caused by their product. As far as I know, that's the only industry that enjoys that kind of protection. However, recently, a court allowed a suit that essentially argued that the gun manufacturer was marketing it specifically to young people. And that is a possible way that you could get at that issue. I don't know that it'll be successful. It'd probably get hung up in the courts for years. The NRA will go nuts about it. And they have very deep pockets and they have a lot of political pull. But I agree with you that if profit is driving a lot of this, if you could find a way to take away the profit, it would help.
Doug, the recent news talked about some of the laws that were enacted in Florida after Parkland that actually seem quite sensible. Florida is turned into a very red state. It had a red a Republican legislature, a Republican governor, and yet they increased the age for buying long rifles from 18 to 21. They put in red flag rules and a number of other things that seem stalled in Washington. Is there any model to be taken from Florida, and any thoughts that you have on why they were successful there but were not able to do so nationally?
I think I don't know specifically about Florida. I believe Florida also requires training courses for concealed carry, which was recently eliminated. You don't even need a permit to carry in New Hampshire anymore, and a whole bunch of other states, 23 of them, I believe, at this point. I don't know under, was that done under the current governor in Florida?
No,
I don't think it was.
I think Scott was governor when it was put in place, or
Yeah.
Scott was governor when it was put in place.
I think basically the only surprise for me is that the current governor in Florida hasn't tried to erode all of those. He just may be politically unable to do so at this point, given all the publicity on Uvalde. But you know, some states have been successful. Massachusetts has the lowest gun violence rate in the country, and they're very successful in putting gun rules in place. When I was competing, when we went into Massachusetts, we had to be careful about rules. We had to, you can take a gun into Massachusetts, but it has to be in a locked container, and the ammunition has to be separate. So you can travel through Massachusetts. When we were competing, we could take our gun, I was a small bore rifle shooter. We could take the rifles in a case, and the ammunition in a separate location, and never had any problem. But there's clear evidence in looking at states with gun violence is the looser the gun regulations, the more violence there is. It's just that simple. What's complicated about things like Chicago, which is often cited as they say, oh, Chicago has gun rules and they have all this violence. That's because 60% of the guns that are used in crimes in Chicago are imported from states that have no gun control regulation. And by the way, that's another problem that is real and serious. There are already so many guns in the United States, is that if we pass gun control tomorrow without some sort of regulation on private sales, those guns would just get passed around for a long time. It's not like we could simply shut off the market for used guns in the United States, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them. I mean, millions of them. It's incredible. We are awash in firearms in the United States.
Other questions? Joseph, you got to turn off mute.
Right.
And you turned it back on again.
Yeah, Doug, I'd like to echo the comments so far of other fellow squires. That was an outstanding presentation. We just make a couple comments. I always have to be a little careful in some of these issues, but I think when the framers of the Constitution put some of those rules in effect, the Second Amendment, the firearm of choice back then was muskets, and a really expert could get about 3 rounds off in a minute if he was really good at it. I'm not sure they could have envisioned what we have today. Further, I wonder of the AR-15s, you know, they say they have a right for protection. I wonder the number of fatalities that have happened, slaughters, murders, versus the number has actually been used in the case of protection. Has there ever been one that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of one. The NRA magazine, and I quit being an NRA member years ago, but it used to publish a little column every issue called The Armed Citizen. And it was always a story about someone who had used a threat of firearm or whatever to protect themselves. but I know of no study that's ever been done on that. And as I said earlier, the NRA has effectively blocked any federal research into firearms research. So part of the issue is that we just don't have a whole lot of data unless it's coming from private foundations on this issue. And also remember, a lot of police departments don't put any of this data into the FBI database. So whatever we've got is incomplete as well.
Yeah, and I must confess that I was a proud member of the NRA right up till 1976, because I also, being in the service and not like yourself, but I was a rifle expert for 6 years and, you know, certified M60 machine gun and all that stuff. So I was very interested in what they were doing for gun instruction and hunter safety courses. In fact, I almost became one of their hunter safety instructors. But I think it was about 1976, you can correct me, when there was a rule that they were going to outlaw Kevlar piercing bullets or rounds. And I think the NRA said, no, you can't do that. And I thought to myself, wait a second, who is wearing Kevlar these days? And it seemed to be our public safety officials, the police, et cetera. Yep. And so they wanted the ability to kill them. I mean, that's my interpretation. So I wrote him a letter and said, we are parting ways as of this date. It's back in 1976.
I quit when Wayne LaPierre made his comment about the ATF officials and referred to them as jackbooted thugs. Yeah. And that was enough for me. I believe George Bush won also quit at the same time over that remark.
I would interject one other thought here. Doug talked about part of the reason that there is political inaction on this is there's an enthusiasm gap between those who are concerned about their guns being taken away and those who are advocates for gun safety and responsible gun use. There were 25 people on this call today. And from the questions and tone that came out, I suspect many, like I, are very concerned about some of the things that are going on. I think it's incumbent on us to demonstrate to our elected officials, including some in the New Hampshire legislature who are quite conservative, if you look at their voting record, that we are enthusiastic and motivated by this issue, and reminding them that their job is to represent us, not the special interests that might be contributing to their coffers. So I'm sorry for the political commercial, but I worry that all of us tend to look at these issues and at times you just put your head in your hands and say, there's not much I can do. I suspect there are things, though, if people hear that we are motivated, that we can do to try and change some of the political winds.
I think the issue about people are concerned about gun massacres of school children. They are. But you measure that against their concern for $5 a gallon gas and grocery bills that are twice what they used to. I hate to be pessimistic, but I expect that Republicans will take over both the House and the Senate at the midterm elections, and that's going to be largely driven by inflation and gas prices. And, you know, those of us who live in New London tend to have higher incomes. And I'll be blunt, gas prices don't mean a damn thing to me, and neither do food prices. So I'm free to vote my conscience on issues without having to worry about my pocketbook. But that's not true of the majority of Americans. And I'll also give you a quote from Winston Churchill. He said, "The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter." And what he meant by that is that the average voter isn't particularly well informed. If you hear somebody who's blaming Biden for gas prices, ask them what specific things Biden has done to increase gas prices or to make it happen. And there's no information. They don't have a clue. That, frankly, gas prices are one of those things that presidents don't impact much at all. In fact, inflation isn't impacted much by presidents. the Fed has a much bigger impact on inflation than any presidential stuff. So I worry about that's an issue. So I don't know. I'll also say that Aristotle's comment was democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. So, so I believe in democracy. I just wish we had a better informed populace. Don, I saw you waving your hand. You're on mute, Don. There you go.
Doug, how can you say that Biden doesn't have anything to do with gas prices when on the first day he started to cripple the fossil fuel industry, and that's why we're where we are today? I don't understand.
Well,
I think as the moderator, we end up going into a discussion that is different than guns. So, Joe, you want to take back over the floor, I think.
I'd be happy to talk to you about that, Don, anytime.
All right. I also am concerned that there were no follow-up to my comment that this is not about the NRA. This is about the person behind the gun, and we need to do something about that. No one else seems interested.
So I'll take the bait on that one. When you allow an 18-year-old, when you say that you have to be 21 to drink, but you can go out and buy an AR-15 as an 18-year-old, the people that are behind the guns and the laws that allow people behind the guns to be of age that we don't even trust them to drink, I don't get where that makes sense on any planet. So yeah, we ought to spend some time talking about the people behind the guns and mental health and all the other things. But there are some common sense ideas that don't necessarily draw that much controversy, I wouldn't think. And it starts with, you can't as an 20-year-old buy a handgun, but you can buy an AR-15. Why is that? And the last 3 massacres have taken place for 18-year-olds who went out and bought guns. AR-15s.
I think the other issue is
this is the area where I like to step in.
Thank you, Joe.
Because there are, I guess, Gary, you have a comment. By the way, Bill, okay. Yeah, Gary, what do you?
So with regard to the AR-15, I guess I'm with most people. I don't understand the logic, not only behind that weapon being sold as a recreational weapon, but also the fact that they can have these huge
magazines.
Yeah, magazines, thanks.
Yeah.
I don't understand it. But with regard to the age, I guess I was thinking as the presentation was going on, and for the most part, 99% of it, Doug, I really enjoyed. You got off the rails a few times politically, but we won't go there. But I'm wondering if we couldn't consider something like, someone that's 18 up to perhaps the age of 21 needs to have a sponsor and hold that sponsor accountable, as well as that 18-year-old or whoever, when they buy a weapon, whether it's an AR-15 or whatever. Certainly, I'm not a doctor, I didn't understand all the psychology and issues, but it seems to me every time we hear about some of these mass shootings where young adults involved, you hear these stories about there was some signs potentially going on ahead of time. And I certainly don't agree with the fact you could buy 2 of them on the same day, but I was just wondering about your thoughts about some of those.
Well, I think that, first of all, I agree with Don that we have a society which doesn't, think a little bit about the way most people get their news. They get their news mostly from the internet, from YouTube. When you do research on where people get their information, they get it from the internet, YouTube, and other sources. We have a Fox News now, which it's interesting. One Trump supporter friend of mine said at one point, the Republicans used to think that Fox News worked for them, and then they've learned that they work for Fox News. I'm not sure about the truth of that, but the fact is we have a media now that is splintered. Think back when you were kids. You had Walter Cronkite and Edward Murrow, and those were considered reliable sources of news for most of America. We all read newspapers that were considered reliable sources of information for most Americans. Now we don't have any reliable sources. The newspaper business has been decimated, especially in small rural populations. I have a friend whose family owned the Republic newspapers in Indiana, and it was a well-respected and professionally run news organization. And once classified ads started to dry up because of the internet, all of these newspapers started to close. And the Republic is now a weekly that's 4 pages long instead of a real newspaper. When you have that kind of lack of credible sources of information, it just gets staggering. The philosopher Hannah Arendt said once, when people are subject to lies all the time, it's not that they start to believe the lies that's the problem. The problem is they start not believing in anything. They don't believe any source of any information. And then you have this whole do your own research movement. You heard Aaron, the quarterback for the Green Bay Packers, who said when asked about his objection to getting the vaccine, I did my own research. Nobody followed up with a question, well, what sources did you use? What information did you consider? Because if your source of news is conspiracy websites, you're not going to get very good information. But if those are the only sources you're familiar with, and nowadays what happens is we all watch television, news, or read newspapers that tend to agree with the point of view that we have.
Doug, I'm not sure you're responding to my suggestion, but go ahead.
The suggestion about magazines, California has a ban on magazines greater than 10. So if you buy a handgun in any gun shop, they will offer you a California regulated one or another one. And the California one is one that only comes with a 10-round magazine.
But you can buy them online, right? You can avoid that, I'm guessing.
Go ahead. Yeah, the problem is it comes with a 10-round magazine, but you can go out and buy one that will fit the gun that carries more. So it's not a very useful regulation. However, I would endorse it nonetheless. The problem is, of course, there's an aftermarket for these magazines that you'd have to regulate, and it's awfully easy to buy one that contains more than 10 rounds. And I'm sorry, Garrett, I got a little. Did I answer any of your question?
Part of it. I mean, the other thing I was trying to suggest or bring up is, do you think there'd be any good in having a requirement for having a sponsor?
I think we do that for driver's license, don't we?
Yes, exactly.
We have learner's permits.
Yep.
And the comment I was going to make about that is, in the case of one of the mass shootings, and there's so many, I can't remember which one this was, the family of the kid who did the shooting is being sued by the government prosecutor for allowing the access to the firearms. And that's another thing, that speaks to your sponsorship idea. If there was someone who was legally responsible other than the young person, that could potentially make a difference. I think responsible people would be open to any of these kinds of ideas. How many of them would make a difference? I honestly don't know. We've never tried it. Never tried any.
Louis Bada, or Lou Bada, had his hand up.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. I wanted to, introduce another angle to the discussion, which was the connection between the wide availability of weapons in the United States and the fact that we are basically the Walmart for international terrorism. And I'll tell you out of personal experience, I piloted one of these embassy airplanes in Colombia to a town in Rio Negro where, hinterlands to the Amazon, where there had been a capture of a significant arsenal of weapons from narco-terrorists. And we brought an ATF person and person, from the intelligence community, and basically all of them had been traced to gun shows in the United States. And I mean, it's a when it comes to the availability in the black market of weaponry, especially now, AR-15s and stuff like that, we really are arming probably the worst people on the face of the earth. And that's stuff that is going to come back to bite us, especially when it comes to now organic terrorism.
Yeah, I think the important thing for all of us to remember is that the federal government, when it arms the military, is buying all of these things from private companies. And those private companies are free to sell to anybody and based on their own conscience. It isn't the military that's designing all these weapons. And certainly the military needs weapons. But the issue is that, for instance, the guy who designed the AR-15 never in his wildest dreams assumed it would be sold to private people. He designed it as a military weapon. But there are larger industries out there. The United States is by far the largest supplier of military arms, but Russia is a big supplier. And then there are smaller suppliers for their individual militaries. The CZ from Czechoslovakia is a popular European sidearm, but it goes back to my original part of this thing. There's 875 million guns in the world, and that's a hell of a lot of guns, and 75% of them are owned by civilians. So.
Well, Doug, I want to kind of wrap up. I think that has been what a discussion, and we could go on and on. I would like to get one last comment in about not so much guns, but your comment about communications in the media, how we used to watch Walter Cronkite, and et cetera, et cetera. And I always look at what went wrong. Well, there used to be a Fair Communications Act in this country. And I think it was in 1990. Now, I'm not being political. I'm just trying to state a fact. The Republicans didn't go for that. Did not go for the 5 minutes here on an article and 5 minutes here, counterbalance, because it wasn't going to win. So they did away with it in 1990, which kicked off such shows as Rush Limbaugh, and then in 1996, Fox News. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm saying that's how I think we got to the point of this start of the communication debacle in this country, the Fair Communications Act.
I think the other part of that is the newspaper business. Mm-hmm. When classified ads dried up, the newspaper business just went crazy. The only real successful newspaper that's migrated to digital subscriptions is the New York Times. And the last I knew, they had around 10 million digital subscribers, but they are the success story on the transfer to digital, and no other. I mean, others have those platforms, but they are not widely profitable. And I worry. I was a reader of the Boston Globe for a long time, but the Boston Globe is largely now a rehash of New York Times articles, and some of the newspapers I was familiar with when there were 7 newspapers that come into my house every day when I was growing up. And you know, they're all gone now. You know, they're just, you know, they're gone. And I think that's terrible that we just don't have any of those. You know, think about the jobs that guys like Woodard and Bernstein did, those kinds of investigative reporters, or the Boston Globe Spotlight thing on the abuses in the Catholic Church. I mean, those things are important. Those are things that need to be done and need to be told. There's stories that need to be investigated. And I just fear that we have very few newspapers that have the money or the interest in doing that anymore. And I think that was particularly injurious to the what we used to call the flyover states, the Midwest and the states that were ignored largely by both Republicans and the Democrats for years. So anyway, the other comment I wanted to make was on the mental health issue. The mental health issue is real, clearly, but lots of other countries have mental health issues. And the difference between their gun rates and ours is they don't have all those guns. So I agree with Don that we have a broken mental health system in this country. But I also think that even if we fix the mental health problem, we're still going to have mass shootings, and we're still going to have the violence that goes on. Again, remember, mass shootings are a tiny part of the problem. Most of the shootings are handguns, and they are suicides. Can we fix those? God, I hope so. But so far, we haven't had much luck.
You're on mute again. Joe, you're on mute.
I'm having fun talking to myself. I want to thank you again, Doug, because you know, that was really a very informative presentation. I think we got some differing views, which I respect, and I think I'd like to encourage. By the way, Doug, I owe you a Squires mug for your presentation today, your steam mug, which people are in search of. I would like to, if Dave Wood is still here, could he tell us what the next meeting is going to be about, the next speaker? And we'll wrap up after that.
Joe, I just wanted to say too, if anybody wants copies of the presentation, I'm happy to forward it to you and you can send it around to people.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll put in a commercial. This will be posted on the Squires homepage or Squires YouTube site.
That's
so
even
you
better.
can listen to it offline as well. Okay. And they can listen to it at 125%. So, you know, it cuts down the amount of time.
So thanks, Joe. I am on. And thanks very much for that presentation on gun safety. I think that's outstanding. You clearly motivated us. I think that's the longest discussion we've ever had. So our speaker next month is Maynard Goldman. His topic is what's wrong with the PGA? Plenty. Maynard holds a BA in political science and economics from the University of Michigan. He has a JD degree from Harvard Law. He's a longtime political consultant on both sides of the aisle. He's done projects for Gerald Ford, Michael Dukakis, Ted Kennedy, Tip O'Neill. He's received appointments from both Republican and Democratic governors. And although that resume doesn't show it, he's also a diligent sports enthusiast. He follows both golf and baseball quite diligently. And indeed, he's given talks at Osher at Dartmouth on a number of topics, including sports. I think, frankly, and I haven't asked Maynard this, but his experience in politics has probably sensitized him to the shenanigans in sports. Anyway, I hope you can join us next month. I think the talk you will find very enjoyable.
Thanks, Dave. And unless there's any other new business to be brought up, I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Thank you all. I appreciated you listening.